Hi, Katha.
Hi, Glenn.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right now that we've solved all our technical problems for the moment.
We did. We had a lot of behind-the-stage difficulties that we've spent a long time resolving, so hopefully this is going to work.
I hope so.
So, welcome to your Blogging Heads debut. It's very exciting.
Well, yeah, if this is indeed my Blogging Heads debut and this is actually recording.
It's at least your debut attempt.
Excuse me?
It's at least your debut attempt.
Okay, my debut attempt. Here we go.
All right. So why don't we introduce ourselves? It's the traditional way to start these.
Okay, I'm Katha Pollitt. I write a column for The Nation magazine every other week called Subject to Debate. I'm also an essayist and a poet.
And I'm Glenn Greenwald, and I write at Salon. So the reason that we are gathered here, you and I, is because there's been this sort of raging debate that's been taking place, largely though not exclusively among progressives, regarding the candidacy of Ron Paul. And I've written a couple of pieces on that topic. You wrote a column on that topic that in part replied to some of what I've said. And we seem to have different views on that, and are sort of representatives of two camps that have arisen and thought that a discussion might be constructive. Hopefully it will be. So what I would propose we would do, if it's good with you, is have each of us just take a couple of minutes to sort of summarize the positions that we've expressed in this debate, just so that we're at least on the same page with what each other thinks. Does that make sense to you?
That sounds good. Would you like to go first?
Sure. So, the reason why I think that's a good thing to do is because I feel as though a lot of people in these debates have been speaking past each other, and in some cases even distorting what other people are saying. I certainly feel like the arguments I've made have been pretty radically distorted in certain instances, including in your column, to be honest. I don't think it was deliberate or malignant or anything like that, but I do think you misstated what I said. So I just want to summarize what I have said on this topic and what I haven't. I began writing about this topic about 10 days ago, and the very first thing that I did before even getting to the topic itself was to explain what it was that I wasn't saying, and to also explain why I thought that the argument that I was making was going to be distorted and how it would be distorted. And what I said was that it's very difficult, especially in an election year, but even generally, with partisan tribalism and loyalties being as intense as they are, to talk about two different candidacies for president, one in one party and one in the other, without having it be misinterpreted that you're endorsing one or opposing the other. And I made very clear that I was not in any way endorsing Ron Paul's candidacy, that I was not arguing that he is better from a progressive perspective overall than President Obama was, and that I was not arguing that progressives in any way should support Ron Paul instead of President Obama. And in fact, not only did I not argue that, I actually repudiated that position, and I made a pretty extensive argument about why it was that progressives would be perfectly reasonable and entitled to vote for President Obama over Ron Paul or to support his candidacy. So I began by saying I'm not endorsing or expressing support for Ron Paul's candidacy, and I wrote sentences like, it's perfectly rational and reasonable for progressives to decide that the evils of their candidate, President Obama, are outweighed by the evils of the GOP candidate, whether Ron Paul or anyone else. And I wrote things like, there are all sorts of legitimate reasons for progressives to oppose Ron Paul's candidacy on the whole. So when I read in The Nation, like I said, I expected lots of people were going to distort that and claim I was endorsing Ron Paul. I didn't expect that you were going to do that, to be honest. I was pretty disappointed when in your column, read, Salon's Glenn Greenwald is so outraged that progressives haven't abandoned the warmongering, drone-sending, indefinite detention supporting Obama for Paul that he accuses them of supporting the murder of Muslim children. I actually am not outraged that progressives haven't abandoned Obama for Paul, and I made clear that I don't think that they need to, and that there's all sorts of rational ways that they would not. So what my argument instead was that is the following, which is that you can take the issues that are being debated in the presidential race in 2012. And I don't mean ancillary, sort of inconsequential, trivial issues. I mean issues that progressives themselves have long claimed are incredibly significant and important. And you could pretty much divide them into two categories. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but this is what I did in what I wrote. One column would be these issues, important issues to progressives, in which President Obama is better than Ron Paul, meaning he's closer to what the progressive position is than Ron Paul. There are lots of important issues where President Obama is closer, much closer to the progressive position than Ron Paul is. These issues are incredibly important and weighty and consequential. But there's also this other column of very weighty and consequential and important issues where Ron Paul is closer, often much closer, to what progressives have always said their position is, than President Obama. So President Obama is better, a lot better on issues like protecting entitlement programs, protecting a woman's right to choose, appointing Supreme Court justices, environmental regulations, enforcing minority rights. But Ron Paul is better and often infinitely better on issues of empire and war and killing foreigners for no good reason, transparency and secrecy, whistleblowing, the drug war, the way the Fed operates in secrecy to transfer wealth to bankers and the upper class. So you have these two columns, one where President Obama is better and one where Ron Paul is better. And my argument was that it's insufficient simply to say, as a progressive, oh look, Ron Paul supports these awful, horrible things, therefore nobody should support him, because President Obama also supports some really horrible, odious, and unprogressive things. That instead an honest debate would mean that you would list the evils of Ron Paul and list the evils of Barack Obama and then weigh them. And that's why I said a progressive could reasonably come to the conclusion that the evils of Ron Paul outweigh the evils of Barack Obama. That said, and I just want to briefly highlight this last point and then turn it over to you. The reason why I wrote the column and focus on Ron Paul is because there are some extremely important points to make about the fact that Ron Paul is better on not just a couple of issues, and not just a couple of ancillary issues, but many issues of significant, great importance to progressive. One important aspect to this is that it is amazing in a very positive way to finally have somebody with a national platform in a presidential race going around not to like-minded audiences, but to evangelical communities in Iowa and very conservative districts in New Hampshire and military communities in South Carolina, and saying things like America's criminal justice system is incredibly racist and the drug war disproportionately imprisons Latinos and African American youth, or that it is not the United States that is the victim of aggression in the world, but often itself the aggressor, and that's the reason why we have so many people wanting to harm us and asking people to imagine what it must be like to have troops occupying your country and drones flying overhead and killing your fellow citizens or imprisoning you without due process. That there's all these arguments that Ron Paul is making that those of us who work on these issues have never been able to get a national figure in the presidential race of any significance who's leading or close to making these arguments. And it's an incredible benefit to have citizens for the first time hearing these views in a presidential race that no one else, Democrat or Republican, are expressing. That's one benefit. The other benefit is that it really highlights some extremely significant deficiencies in the Democratic Party and the progressive movement that the candidate who leads the party and who most progressives will march behind is somebody who takes the opposite view of the ones Ron Paul's expressing. Barack Obama is somebody who's aggressively prosecuting this racist drug war. He has claimed the right to assassinate American citizens without due process. He has escalated the drone campaign, slaughtered all kinds of children and women and innocent men as well. In the Muslim world, is very fixated on secrecy, punishing whistleblowers, empowering the Fed. All these areas where if Ron Paul weren't in the race, there would be no debate in the presidential year because Obama is horrible on these things and Republicans besides Ron Paul who are running either agree with him or worse. And so Ron Paul really does show how you could have a progressive candidate standing up and articulating these views and still be politically successful. And I think that's an incredibly important benefit to his candidacy as well. It doesn't mean you endorse Ron Paul. I don't think Ron Paul has any chance whatsoever of winning the presidency. I don't think very many people, even his supporters, think he does. The issue is that it benefits the debate and the way in which many Americans who don't pay attention except during the presidential race get to think about politics for the first time, and that's, you know, the argument.
Well, that was extremely well expressed. And I want to say, before I say anything else, I do think I got your position wrong. And I'm really sorry about that. And when I return to this subject in my next column, I'll certainly say that. I wasn't actually even thinking of you primarily. I'm sorry to say that doesn't sound right. I came out wrong. But I was more thinking actually of people who, like Bob Scheer, people who do, you know, I think genuinely care about things like the welfare state. They write endlessly about poverty, about racism, about the whole spectrum of progressive ideas, and to have them say things like, "Oh, pure conservatism, values, principle, he's so consistent," that I find very disturbing. And to me, that was sort of an example of something that I think progressives do a lot for reasons we can talk about, which is that they do have a tendency to run after the latest shiny thing, and that there'll be some banner issue of the moment. I don't mean that the issues that Ron Paul has the positions we like on our banner issues are of the moment. They're not, but there's a certain kind of just running after someone who is really bad on almost everything, but you like one or two things they do, and then that becomes the big thing. And it really bothers me. And that was where I got into something that a lot of people have taken issue in my piece, which we can talk about later. I know it's on our little list, but issues of gender and issues of race. That I do think it's kind of not an accident when people talk a lot about who supports Ron Paul and how it's a lot of military people, and that's very interesting. But if you look at who donates to him, it really is almost all men. It's like 4 out of 5. And if you go to his conventions, there's just a lot of men there. There's a big line. It's one of the few places somebody tweeted that you'd find a long line for the men's room, and you can walk right into the ladies' room. And I think that there is a way in which the issues having to do with race and gender get marginalized and get reduced to sort of single issues like, abortion rights, when it's that is something that is much harder for women to do and people of color to do. And I don't want to say that I'm speaking for all people of color or indeed all women, because I know that I'm not. But I just think if you kind of look at the demographics, that is what you'll see, which doesn't mean that there aren't blacks who support Ron Paul and women who support Ron Paul and all that. But I think that what really bothers me about Ron Paul is that I do see the issues that you and I both care about, that you've discussed so eloquently, as being kind of the first and positive layer of a worldview that is really terrible. And I think that he gets a lot of support because what's really, for me, what his position boils down to is states' rights. He wants to get rid of everything the federal government does, including some of the bad things like, killing Muslim children, and a lot of the good things, like, for example,
environmental regulation.
Environmental regulations, support for schools, but also he has persistently maintained his opposition to the Civil Rights Act. He believes that you should have the right to refuse in your business to accommodate people you don't want to accommodate. So that would basically bring back segregation. And I do think that his states' rights have a very Southern flavor. And I think that's where a lot of his support comes from. And that's why, his support is when he goes to these evangelical churches, do you really think they're saying, yes, I think pot should be legal? I don't think they're thinking that. I think they're thinking, yes, and then we'll get lots of money for homeschooling, and then those dirty hippies will stop telling in Washington will stop telling us what to do, and we can have prayer in the schools, and we can make abortion illegal, and we'll have judges that will enforce our worldview. I think that's what a lot of it is all about.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess what if I could just, you talked for a long time, I'll talk for a little more too. I guess what I would say is that there is really not a reason for people who have the full range of progressive politics to tie themselves like a tin can to the Ron Paul campaign. I think that he discredits those issues, because not only would he, for example, not make war in all these places we don't want him to make war, he'd get us out of the UN. There would be no foreign aid, so that no help for horrible diseases around the world, no help if there's for big tsunamis and all like that. No kind of, it's that kind of really old-fashioned isolationism that I don't think is very realistic, and I don't think would have a lot of bad consequences as well as a couple of good consequences.
Right. So just a couple of things. I mean, I think first of all, I think you're right that there is some sizable portion of his supporters who basically are standard issue Republicans, but even a little bit more extreme, like kind of the Bircher strain, who are attracted to his sort of vision of the pre-Civil Rights Act, pre-integration, kind of Jim Crow era. I think there's some people who just want the government out of their lives in every way, good and bad, and they believe that he's the one who's most extreme on the Republican road and therefore support him. But I also think that there's a very sizable portion of his supporters, and I think anybody who follows his campaign or who has written about it knows this, who are not at all Republican voters traditionally, and probably won't even support the Republican nominee. In fact, Ron Paul probably won't even support the ultimate Republican nominee. He didn't in 2008. And these are a lot of young voters who are sitting there cheering for his inveighing against foreign wars and the way in which it destroys our economic security as a country and kills foreigners needlessly. And then, there's also a very big segment of the punditocracy, and this is one part that I felt like, was sort of inaccurate in what you said too. You wrote about people who are praising Ron Paul's candidacy. You said, and yes, these are all white men. If there are leftish white women and people of color who admire Paul, they're keeping pretty quiet. And actually, I just don't, I didn't think that's true. I've been following the Ron Paul debate very closely. And even before you wrote your piece, there have been lots of very prominent minority political commentators in prominent platforms who have said more or less the same thing I've said, and others have said that Ron Paul's candidacy brings important benefits because he is out there arguing critical issues that nobody else is arguing. You have Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, who basically went on Blogging Heads actually for 15 minutes and praised Ron Paul's candidacy with lots of criticisms, but lots of praise as well. Ta-Nehisi Coates did it in The Atlantic, saying that Paul is the only person who's willing to stand up and say, imagine what will happen if our country were invaded and occupied. The African American columnist Les Payne was astonished by Ron Paul standing up in a GOP debate and condemning the American criminal justice system as racist. You have Wendy Kaminer, the former ACLU board member, who in The Atlantic said, basically, if you care about civil liberties, not certain civil liberties where Ron Paul is awful, but the civil liberties that have been the most talked about in the war on terror, Ron Paul is far and away the best candidate in the Republican Democratic field. Cornel West, Zaid Jilani, lots of people of color in very prominent positions making the same argument. And I think in terms of your discussion of gender and race that you had in your article and that you just had now, to me, I don't know if you saw this essay or not. It was by Falguni Sheff, who's a professor of political theory and philosophy at Hampshire College. And
I did see that.
Did you see that?
I did, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, the point that she made, I am fascinated in your response to this, because I think it goes to the heart of what the disagreement that I had with you and what you wrote and in what you just said. And I agree. Look, I think we're on the same page with a lot of these things, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you as opposed to other people who have been opposed, because I do think we're both coming from the same place in terms of believing these issues are important and have a difference about whether Ron Paul's candidacy is a good vehicle for bringing them up. But what she was basically, her argument was basically that, that it would be nice if there were somebody other than Ron Paul making these arguments in a presidential race. And of course, a lot of us do talk about these issues all the time without, mentioning Ron Paul. I mean, I've spent the last 6 years more or less working exclusively on, these issues of civil rights abridgment and war and the drug war and these horrible policies that primarily harm not white males, but racial and ethnic and religious minorities. But her argument was that for white progressives and for Democratic partisans who basically want to say, look, these issues that Ron Paul is shining a light on in a way that none of us can because he's a leading presidential candidate in a presidential year, are not sort of, what did you call it? You called it a handful of cherries on a blighted tree. Sort of, there's a couple of issues that he's good on. She was saying these issues are of immense importance, not to white people, but to people of color, to women in the third world, in the Muslim world, to African Americans who are victimized by the drug war, to, that these policies that he's challenging, that he alone is challenging, and that are bipartisan consensus, are really important to people of color and to women, and that those people who want to deprioritize them and say, oh, look, he's right on a couple of issues, but look at all these much more important issues that he's wrong on, those are the people who are really guilty of talking from white privilege, because it's not you who is going to have your kids blown up by a drone, or it's not you who's going to be put in Gitmo without due process or put in a cage for using drugs. These are people of color and Muslims and minorities, and it's very easy to be dismissive of the huge values that Ron Paul is bringing to our
okay, but if she's right, then black people and people of color should be voting for Ron Paul in droves, but are they? No, what I said, actually, if I just could correct you with one thing. What I said was, if there are leftish white women and people of color who admire Paul, they're keeping pretty quiet. I didn't say there are none of them, but I did say leftish. And the people of color you mentioned, with a few exceptions, are conservatives. John McWhorter is conservative. He doesn't care about a lot of these issues where he's terribly, terribly wrong. And I would say, suddenly, the drug war is a very important issue, but I think it's really interesting that all of a sudden it has become this banner issue. I don't even know if we took a poll of the black community if they would be in favor of getting rid of all drug, of making heroin legal. That's a pretty extreme position. Making cocaine legal. I think, decriminalization of certain things, sure, okay. I don't even know what my position is about, making heroin legal. I would really need to think about that a lot. But I think that some of these issues that have become very banner issues because Ron Paul has talked about them and has made them very prominent, because he doesn't want to talk about things like, and if I was president, you could have all the heroin you wanted, but if you wanted to travel from New York to Florida in a car as a black person, you might find there's no motels you could stay in for hundreds and hundreds of miles. You might find you couldn't eat in a restaurant. You might find there was no place for you to go to the bathroom. That's what it was like. That's what he wants back, I think that these are not little details. I was just discussing, and I want to say another thing, which is about civil liberties. What are civil liberties? You know something? The right of an American to go into a restaurant and be served is a civil liberty. The right of women to control their own bodies is a civil liberty.
Of course.
And these are not marginal, separate things that just affect a few people, or we can just detach them. They are just as important as freedom of speech.
Absolutely.
And the things that Ron Paul has opposed have made lives better for millions and millions of people. They have made the modern America we live in. The good part where we don't have segregation, where you do, if you feel where there is an equal opportunities commission, where Ron Paul has said, if a woman is sexually harassed, she should quit her job. I mean, what does that tell you, you know, about his worldview? Now, that's something, if he was president, he could probably do a lot about. I think that that Ron Paul's worldview is completely horrible. And that the good things about it flow out of those horrible things. He basically doesn't believe in the functions of government to ameliorate anything. You're on your own. That's libertarianism. You don't have health insurance, find a charity or die. He really believes that. I think that what is interesting about his candidacy is that he is the only person who is really talking about the issues that we care about. And I think maybe we should talk about, move on to, we wanted in our little list, we wanted to talk about, well, why is that? And what, if say you don't want to be associated with Ron Paul, who, and his views that AIDS was hatched in a lab and that the new money, the new colored money is intended to track American citizens and all that stuff. Say he just is unacceptable. What then?
Well, right. I mean, this to me is the real dilemma, and it's why I wrote about it. I mean, I remember, probably 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago, before Ron Paul announced his candidacy, there was talk that Gary Johnson, who has a lot of the same views as Ron Paul, without a lot of the sort of baggage. And he was a popular two-term governor of New Mexico and all of this, was considering running. And I had actually said that I hoped that he ran because I thought he would be a good spokesperson for these issues. Because I can tell you, I mean, we all work on our certain issues primarily. It doesn't mean that we think those issues are more important than ones we don't work on. All of us can only work on a certain set. But, for those of us who work on war on terror issues, killing people without due process, the drug war, which a lot of us have thought was important, but it doesn't get talked about because the two parties are so completely alike on the issues that it's just not part of our debate. Things like, fealty to Israel. The problem really is that, you can break through in little bits and pieces as a commentator, as an activist, as a writer, and get people to be open to the ideas. But the reality is that presidential elections are completely dominant in our political culture. I mean, they're what shape what issues are even up for debate. When the two major presidential candidates agree on a certain position, it's just silenced in terms of discussion. And so presidential elections are incredibly significant, in terms of shaping how Americans think about politics. There are millions and millions of Americans, maybe most, I don't know, who don't read The Nation and don't read Salon and don't read very many other political journals and who don't even pay attention to politics except when it comes to the presidential election. So if there's nobody out there arguing these positions, they're not going to be argued, and they're not even going to be on the radar. And that's why, issues like Israel and endless war and empire and the drug war and the Fed aren't prominent because both parties are in full agreement on them, basically. And that was why so many of us have been looking for somebody to be able to inject these issues into the political discourse. And all the things that you said about Ron Paul, I could quibble with a lot of them. I could disagree with others. There's no question that he's very anathema to progressives in lots of critical ways. He's not going to be the president. I actually think presidents have more power on the stuff where he's good, like foreign policy and civil liberties, when it comes to the war on terror type civil liberties, and even enforcing the drug war, than say on domestic issues where Congress is more important. But it's not that he's going to be president. The question is, people are looking for a way to change the debate on these issues, to get Americans more open to these views that they haven't even heard, let alone effectively are advocated. And that's why a lot of people have said, yes, Ron Paul is horrible in lots of ways, but at least he's out there for the first time standing up in places that don't hear these things and advocating these positions. And I don't know, I mean, what is the alternative? If you say, lots of liberals in Congress have worked with Ron Paul in all sorts of ways, like Barney Frank and Alan Grayson and Dennis Kucinich have sponsored Build with him, have reached out to him as the key ally. So if you say he's too toxic, his worldview is too awful, you shouldn't get anywhere near him, then what is the alternative? I mean, you march behind Barack Obama and all these policies for the next year during the presidential campaign will go unquestioned and unchallenged. And that, to me, is unacceptable. And I think that's what's driving a lot of people to point to the benefits of his candidacy.
Well, I would say that maybe Occupy Wall Street provides another model of how to influence the public debate. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, isn't it, Glenn, that these, people have managed to really, I think, introject a whole new language into the discussion of class, of social class in America, and into what kind of a country are we becoming in general. And they've done that not through going on television and having debates with Mitt Romney and all that. There are other ways to do politics than by being a presidential candidate. I think you're right that it's a great platform, and that that is one of many ways to influence the debate, but it's not the only one. And I guess maybe it just comes down to, I don't know, sort of kind of a gestalt of politics that I would rather spend my time with Occupy Wall Street and that kind of real grassroots sort of a movement that also challenges the nature of what our country is becoming in very fundamental ways than with Ron Paul and his right-wing libertarians. I just think that under the blanket of Ron Paul would come in a lot of things we wouldn't like at all. And I don't know, I think maybe you're more sympathetic to libertarianism than I am. I would find, let's just throw everything back to the states, very disturbing. For example, I was talking to a Ron Paul supporter who was a woman who lives in South Carolina, and it was really interesting. But I said to her, we were talking, of course, she's completely in favor of making abortion a crime. But of course it wouldn't happen, she says, at the federal level, even though Ron Paul has also voted for...
Wait, she's against making abortion criminal, or she's in favor?
No, she was definitely in favor. And she said, well, it's murder. And I said, so you're saying, like, if the state wanted to prosecute it like it's murder, that would be okay. And she says, well, it is murder. So in other words, if South Carolina wanted to, put doctors on death row, that would be okay with her, and women too, presumably. I just think there's a lot in that sort of inchoate right-wing stuff where homeschooling meets anti-choice, meets global warming denialism. I mean, there's all that stuff out there. There is just, Ron Paul is promoting that too. And that, I think, is really toxic. And I just don't want to be part of looking at the whole Ron Paul picture and saying, like my colleague John Nichols at The Nation, praising his, quote, pure conservatism. Why would I praise pure conservatism? I'm not a conservative.
Right.
What's great about, I'm not even so big on purity. I mean, this is politics we're talking about. So I think there have to be other ways, and I agree, The Nation and Salon are probably not going to be able to do this, unfortunately.
Right.
But I think Occupy Wall Street is a way to start affecting this debate.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's a great point. I agree with you completely. I mean, I've been, writing about Occupy Wall Street in the most enthusiastic ways that I can from the very start. I went on my book tour, and the thing I was much more excited about than the book events I was doing was going to these encampments and speaking at a bunch of them. And I think it's one of the most exciting things and important things to happen in politics in a long time. And the big reason is that, as you suggested, it's effectuating change, not just in terms of policy change, but debate and how people conceive of politics. And it's doing it outside of the the two-party system. It's doing it through a completely bottom-up, organic means of organizing and protesting. It has all the right values. It's providing a template for how people can reinstall fear in the hearts of elites, which I think is one of the critical priorities. So I'm a huge fan of Occupy Wall Street. I agree with everything you said about the potential for it to change and all of that. The one thing I would say, though, is that I do think that one of the distinctions between Occupy Wall Street and the Ron Paul president, candidacy, in terms of their benefit, is that I do think that things get very easily pigeonholed and kind of put into this kind of ideological box. And Occupy Wall Street got depicted very early on as sort of this left-wing movement, even though it has a lot in common with a lot of the anger that spawned the original Tea Party before it got co-opted by the Republicans. It has, these views and discontent that I think pervades the citizenry and transcends ideology. I think, Fox News and the right-wing noise machine kind of trained their followers to see Occupy Wall Street as sort of this socialist movement that's of the left, and therefore a lot of people just tune out when it comes to that. The way people on the left do with the Tea Party. One of the things that I find fascinating about Ron Paul and the candidacy of Ron Paul is exactly that he is a right-wing libertarian running in the Republican Party in extremely conservative states and bringing that message there. And I'm not sure that Occupy Wall Street or things like it could achieve that. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I see them both as beneficial on these issues. But let me ask you this, because the one thing you keep bringing up are all the things that you find odious about Ron Paul's worldview. And like I said, I think some of them are overstated. I think some of them are a bit oversimplified and alarmist. Some of them are accurate. But let me just concede that there's a bunch of horrible things that he thinks. And clearly, from the progressive worldview, there's no question that that's true. So your argument is, well, look, I don't want to be part of this candidacy that has all these horrible positions. And the reason that, I actually wrote my first piece and called it I forget what it was, but the progressive fallacies on Ron Paul is because that is true that Ron Paul has a bunch of horrible views, but it is also true that the Democratic Party really does have a bunch of horrible views as well. And I don't want to go through them all again, but they've resulted in some really horrible and awful things. They destroy minority communities in the terms of the drug war. They kill all kinds of people all throughout the world. They keep the system of finance that benefits bankers at the expense of the middle class going and churning along. They propagate the status quo much more than they subvert or undermine it. They've embraced more radical positions than George Bush and Dick Cheney did when it comes to presidential power and the right to conduct themselves in secret and with no checks or due process, put people in prison, kill them, etc. Really awful, horrible things as well. And so, when I hear people saying, as you've said, I don't want to be anywhere near the Ron Paul candidacy, even though it has benefits, because they have all these awful prongs to it, I wonder why you don't think the same way about the Democratic Party. Not to say that I expect you to say I'm not going to vote for the Democrats or anything else like that, but why doesn't that same mindset get applied to the Obama presidency and his party?
Well, I guess it's a little bit for the same reason that I guess it's because one is in the Democratic Party, so that you see I'm trying to formulate this in a careful way, and I'm going to fail, but if you see the Democratic Party and to the left of there as the place where you do your politics, and the place that in the end of the day you are associated with, then you see you're fighting that sort of from within. You don't want to go back 50 years and re-argue segregation. Issues like who would control the Supreme Court are become very important. I think that you have done a real service in reminding, people, Democrats and people on the left end of the spectrum of really that the Democratic Party, never so great, has really kind of moved very far to the right in all kinds of issues that we don't talk enough about. That's really true. But you know, it's a little bit, I was thinking about this, like, okay, take Roosevelt. Roosevelt, who, you know, if you think about his record, he put all those Japanese American citizens in concentration camps or relocation camps or whatever you want to call them. He turned back the St. Louis and, you know, sending all these Jews back to Hitler. The social security system he set up would discriminate against women. A lot of his social welfare programs has discriminated against blacks. He never favored a federal anti-lynching law, which was one of the, you know, big causes of black civil liberties people and left-wing people at that time. The whole Democratic Party was this weird alliance between Southern white racists and Northern unions, ethnics, and ethnic groups, and all the rest. Of black people in the North, the ones who got to vote, tended to be Republicans at that time, precisely because of that. But anyway, you know, there's just no question that my grandparents, Jews that they were going to vote for FDR. There was, you know, they weren't going to say, oh, he turned back to St. Louis, I'm not voting for him. You know, terrible as that was, because at the end of the day, you know, people make fun of the politics of lesser of two evils, but that's always what it's going to be.
Right.
That's always what it's going to be. And if you want to be pure and go to heaven, then you don't vote. But once you're in that discourse, you are choosing between various horrible people who want to do one list of horrible things or another list of horrible things, and very often it's 90% the same list of horrible things. So I would say, you know, you have really inspired me that I have got to, feature more highly in my own writing and thinking these very important issues. But you haven't persuaded me that I have to do it by saying nice things about Ron Paul.
Right. No. Look, I mean, you know, and like I said, I mean, I'm not arguing against lesser of two evil voting because I think you're right. You know, it's the political system is such that you're always going to have that. My guess is that if Ron Paul were in the Oval Office, and I don't think he ever will be. But I think if he were, I think that his, what John Nichols has called this sort of purity of conservatism would probably give way to lots of power considerations in politics, and all of that. I guess what I want to see a little bit more of, and I don't really mean from, I don't mean from you, because I think you actually, among writers in, mainstream liberal journals, are probably more critical of Democrats and even progressives than most other people. But that's what you just said. That's really what kind of inspired me to write that original column. Was I was seeing these progressives run around saying, "Oh my God, look at this horrible thing Ron Paul thinks, and look at this other horrible thing Ron Paul thinks," without ever saying, as though if you can identify some horrible thing that someone believes, then it's proof that you stay away from that person as far away as you can. And what was missing from that equation for me was the acknowledgement that it isn't just Ron Paul who believes in lots of horrible things. He may believe in more than others, but it's not just him. It's the Democratic Party and even lots of progressive politicians who are supporting and enabling and doing lots of horrible, awful, evil, odious things as well. And the election isn't a good versus evil election. It's, here are various politicians who are doing and believing a bunch of awful, horrible things, and the question is to figure out, weighing them honestly and candidly, which one is the worst one, and then voting for the one that's less. And I think Ron Paul aids in that process, to be honest. I don't think we would be having a Bogdan Heads discussion talking about the drug war in the Democratic Party, or Israel in the Democratic Party, or this idea that we should imagine what it's like to live in a country that's treated the way we treat other countries, and what that would entail. Or at least maybe you and I would, but lots of other people wouldn't be talking about these things if it weren't for the Ron Paul candidacy. And for someone who's been wanting these issues in the floor for so long, I guess, and I'm not the only one, you react with some degree of just celebration, even recognizing that he's, lots of his positions are awful. And I think it's just a sign of kind of how unfortunately, what low quality our political culture is, that it does take a Ron Paul just to even insert these extremely consequential policies into the debate.
Well, okay, so he did that, so now could he go away? We could talk about them without talking about him.
Well, I mean, I guess it's probably
thanks and goodbye.
More minds but then the question becomes, even once he does stop running, there's going to be all these people out there who, it's interesting. I mean, Barack Obama brought a lot of young people into the political process who would not have gotten involved in the absence of the Obama candidacy. There's a lot of people, who are that way with Ron Paul, and those people are in the process and up for grabs. And I think that there are a lot of them attracted to his candidacy not because of his opposition to the Civil Rights Act or his, desire to overturn Roe versus Wade, but because of the good issues that we've been talking about, especially younger citizens. And I would hope that we then start to figure out, sort of post-Paul, how to take those good parts and integrate them into the progressive movement or the left or the Democratic Party or politics generally, and keep those issues sort of vibrant and talked about.
Yeah, those issues. Keep them vibrant.
The
but
good
what
ones.
What I wonder about, here are all these young people, and they don't have jobs, and they are suffering terribly from both the economy and also, what about their Pell Grants, what about student debt, all like that. And I would not want to encourage them to think that a government that sort of did less in the social welfare department would be good for them. Social Security won't be there for me, so we shouldn't have it. That kind of thing that you sometimes hear from right-wing young people. Mm-hmm. Because, to me, they're the victims of the massive kind of defunding of the sort of good elements of government. I mean, look, right now, look what we have. We have, 1 in 7, 1 in 8 people on food stamps in this country? I mean, that is a tremendous statement about how people are struggling and suffering. And I do think that I wouldn't want people to get the message, if the government does less for you and just lets the economy rip, the economy, quote unquote, lets the market rip, everything's going to be great for you, and that the market can solve every problem. And I think that because the state has done such a poor job, and also people don't really know what the state does for them, they don't really follow these things very closely. I think that that kind of libertarianism could be very destructive.
Mm-hmm. But what's interesting, Katha, I mean, and I agree that, I think it would be a moral outrage to start, especially in this economy with income and wealth inequality being at, truly destructive levels, to start exacerbating it by cutting into social programs and the sort of remaining safety net that keeps people at least in some, civilized form of life. But one of the, if you go and talk to a lot of those younger people who are very anxious about their economic future, one of the reasons why the Paul candidacy appeals to them is that, he's out there making this argument. And it's not a completely true argument, but it's true in a pretty substantial way, which is one of the reasons why, we have all these pressures of austerity. And remember, President Obama wanted to raise the eligibility age for Medicare and slash Social Security pretty significantly. He offered those things as part of the last debt increase negotiation, according to every major media outlet. One of the reasons why there's such austerity pressure is because we have these unsustainable imperial policies of huge numbers of bases all around the world, managing the Middle East, constant, endless warfare, this extremely bloated military, even the drug war, which is incredibly expensive in the criminal justice system to keep prosecuting and arresting and imprisoning huge numbers of Americans, and then the opportunity cost of losing their contributions positively to society, that it's not even like you can't even really extricate the domestic and foreign policy questions completely, or even substantially, because a big part of why there's such pressure that the political class and the financial class is imposing on the rest of us to have these austerity policies is because the choices that we're making are so warped and distorted, and we're not putting our money into education and Social Security and expanded Medicare. We're instead putting them into newer and sleeker drones and huge numbers of bombs and massive military bases and sprawling prisons. And I think part of the appeal that young voters see in the Paul candidacy is that economic message that, if we keep choosing to be this bloated empire, that it'll be impossible, even for the most well-meaning liberal politicians, to provide good entitlement programs for the middle and lower classes.
Yeah, except that Ron Paul doesn't favor those good entitlement programs. He thinks, let's get rid of all that. First of all, he thinks we should take the soldiers from, Korea and places like that and put them on the Mexican border. It's not like, he does have some sort of funny, weird twists in all of this. It's not like he's saying, we'll send them home back to, go work in their communities, like as civilians. He wants to put them on the Mexican border. He said that. He doesn't want there to be a fence because that could be used to keep Americans in, as we all try to flee, the giant tentacles of the welfare state to go live in Mexico. But he wants there to be all these soldiers on the Mexican border.
Nothing comparable to the imperial presence that we have in the world. That would be in a Paul presidency, which will never exist, and everyone knows will never exist, there would be massive decreases beyond the status quo in military spending, and no matter how many troops you wanted to put on the Mexican border. But I think that's pretty clear. And then the cost of the drug war as well, that you would add into that. But don't you think that is a real question? One of the threats, the biggest threats to the sort of New Deal and post-New Deal entitlement programs, and to what has guaranteed an American middle class is not just Republican ideology. It is financial constraints that come from trying to be this militaristic empire and having this sprawling, turning America into a sprawling prison. It's incredibly expensive.
It is incredibly expensive, and we get very little back for it that's good. I think, I just want to say, I opposed both these wars from the very beginning. I opposed the war in Afghanistan before it even started, for which Andrew Sullivan said that I was like a person who sees a rape victim and blames it on her short skirt. He actually said that.
It's funny. This is, that right after, I remember 2000, after the 9/11 attacks, when I first started paying attention to online commentary, one of the very first things I encountered was your article in which you had said almost immediately after 9/11, and in retrospect, I really do think it was heroic of you, basically said that you had discouraged your daughter from hanging the American flag outside of the building.
Oh yeah, they're going to put that column on my grave. that's like the most notorious thing I ever wrote.
Right, and then that was my first exposure to sort of this online debate post 9/11, and to your writing, and Andrew Sullivan had basically declared you the leader of the fifth column as a result of that column. So yeah. You've been. That's why I know you've been. An eloquent and outspoken opponent longer than most of us of all of these policies. So, I would think you would be excited as well to see, huge numbers of Republican voters voting for a candidate who is steadfastly against them.
I just wonder if that's why they're voting for him.
At the very least, they're voting for him despite that, right? Those are not disqualifying views, which is pretty amazing in itself. And I do think, like I said, I do think a lot of these sort of heterodox new voters are definitely attracted by that message. But anyway, I don't know. I think we've had a great discussion.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was actually kind of dreading it.
Well,
I was actually kind of dreading it, but
it's the kind of discussion, especially in the midst
It was
of the
fun.
contentious debate that took
What?
place. It's the sort of discussion, especially given that it's in the midst of this contentious debate where both people had to kind of make a concerted effort to make it more constructive rather than acrimonious, and I think we did a good job.
good. Well, good for us.
Yes,
So this was
yay
really
for us.
fun, and I hope someday we'll get to have a real life drink together.
Would love that, Katha. Thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks to you too. Bye bye.
Bye-bye. I expected lots of people were going to distort that and claim I was endorsing Ron Paul. I didn't expect that you were going to do that, to be honest. I was pretty disappointed when in your column read, Salon's Glenn Greenwald is so outraged that progressives haven't abandoned the warmongering, drone-sending, indefinite detention supporting Obama for Paul, that he accuses them of supporting the murder of Muslim children. I actually am not outraged that progressives haven't abandoned Obama for Paul, and I made clear that I don't think that they need to, and that there's all sorts of rational ways that they would not. So what my argument instead was that is the following, which is that you can take the issues that are being debated in the presidential race in 2012, and I don't mean ancillary, sort of inconsequential, trivial issues. I mean issues that progressives themselves have long claimed are incredibly significant and important. And you could pretty much divide them into two categories. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but this is what I did in what I wrote. One column would be these issues, important issues to progressives, in which President Obama is better than Ron Paul, meaning he's closer to what the progressive position is than Ron Paul. There are lots of important issues where President Obama is closer, much closer to the progressive position than Ron Paul is. These issues are incredibly important and weighty and consequential. But there's also this other column of very weighty and consequential and important issues where Ron Paul is closer, often much closer, to what progressives have always said their position is, than President Obama. So President Obama is better, a lot better on issues like protecting entitlement programs, protecting a woman's right to choose, appointing Supreme Court justices, environmental regulations, enforcing minority rights. But Ron Paul is better and often infinitely better on issues of empire and war and killing foreigners for no good reason, transparency and secrecy, whistleblowing, the drug war, the way the Fed operates in secrecy to transfer wealth to bankers and the upper class. So you have these two columns, one where President Obama is better and one where Ron Paul is better. And my argument was that it's insufficient simply to say, as a progressive, oh look, Ron Paul supports these awful, horrible things, therefore nobody should support him, because President Obama also supports some really horrible, odious, and unprogressive things. That instead an honest debate would mean that you would list the evils of Ron Paul and list the evils of Barack Obama and then weigh them. And that's why I said a progressive could reasonably come to the conclusion that the evils I've said. And we seem to have different views on that and are sort of representatives of two camps that have arisen and thought that a discussion might be constructive. Hopefully it will be. So what I would propose we would do, if it's good with you, is have each of us just take a couple of minutes to sort of summarize the positions that we've expressed in this debate, just so that we're at least on the same page with what each other thinks. Does that make sense to you?
That sounds good. Would you like to go first?
Sure. So, the reason why I think that's a good thing to do is because I feel as though a lot of people in these debates have been speaking past each other, and in some cases even distorting what other people are saying. I certainly feel like the arguments I've made have been pretty radically distorted in certain instances, including in your column, to be honest. I don't think it was deliberate or malignant or anything like that, but I do think you misstated what I said. So I just want to summarize what I have said on this topic and what I haven't. I began writing about this topic about 10 days ago, and the very first thing that I did before even getting to the topic itself was to explain what it was that I wasn't saying, and to also explain why I thought that the argument that I was making was going to be distorted and how it would be distorted. And what I said was that it's very difficult, especially in an election year, but even generally, with partisan tribalism and loyalties being as intense as they are, to talk about two different candidacies for president, one in one party and one in the other, without having it be misinterpreted that you're endorsing one or opposing the other. And I made very clear that I was not in any way endorsing Ron Paul's candidacy, that I was not arguing that he is better from a progressive perspective overall than President Obama was, and that I was not arguing that progressives in any way should support Ron Paul instead of President Obama. And in fact, not only did I not argue that, I actually repudiated that position, and I made a pretty extensive argument about why it was that progressives would be perfectly reasonable and entitled to vote for President Obama over Ron Paul or to support his candidacy. So I began by saying I'm not endorsing or expressing support for Ron Paul's candidacy, and I wrote sentences like, it's perfectly rational and reasonable for progressives to decide that the evils of their candidate, President Obama, are outweighed by the evils of the GOP candidate, whether Ron Paul or anyone else. And I wrote things like, there are all sorts of legitimate reasons for progressives to oppose Ron Paul's candidacy on the whole. So when I read in The Nation, like I said, Hi, Katha.
Hi, Glenn.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right now that we've solved all our technical problems for the moment.
We did. We had a lot of behind-the-stage difficulties that we've spent a long time resolving, so hopefully this is going to work.
I hope so.
So welcome to your Blogging Heads debut. It's very exciting.
Well, yeah, if this is indeed my Blogging Heads debut and this is actually recording.
It's at least your debut attempt.
Excuse me?
It's at least your debut attempt.
Okay, my debut attempt. Here we go.
All right. So why don't we introduce ourselves? It's the traditional way to start these.
Okay, I'm Katha Pollitt. I write a column for The Nation magazine every other week called Subject to Debate. I'm also an essayist and a poet.
And I'm Glenn Greenwald, and I write at Salon. So the reason that we are gathered here, you and I, is because there's been this sort of raging debate that's been taking place, largely, though not exclusively, among progressives regarding the candidacy of Ron Paul. And I've written a couple of pieces on that topic. You wrote a column on that topic that in part replied to some of what